Are those really women soldiers? I've never seen such a thing. What do they want?
April 1945. A cold wind moves across a makeshift prisoner processing yard on the outskirts of a captured German town. The war is in its final weeks, but for hundreds of German female auxiliaries, Helferinnen, signal operators, nurses, clerks, the moment feels suspended in a strange, unfamiliar silence. Dust rises with every shuffle of boots on gravel. Several U.S. military trucks come to a stop, their engines clicking as they cool. The German women expect male guards, officers, interrogators. Instead, stepping down from the trucks are American women in uniform. WACs, military police women. Nurses with helmets pushed back on their heads. Their movements are calm, efficient, assured. They carry clipboards, canteens, holstered sidearms. They speak with a confidence that lands heavier than any weapon. German eyes follow their posture, their ease, the authority in their gestures. Nothing like the propaganda-fed image they had grown up believing. Some German prisoners look away. Others stare openly, confusion shadowing their faces. A few whisper to each other, unsure how to interpret what they are seeing. Because in this single moment, before the questioning even begins, something deeper is already happening. Years of ideology quietly beginning to fracture. And this first encounter leads directly into the world that shaped it.
The shock that swept through groups of captured German women in 1944 and 1945 did not come from the presence of American uniforms alone. It came from the collision of two radically different worlds, two systems that had shaped women's lives in entirely opposite directions. To understand why these encounters felt so profound, we must step back into the years that shaped the women who now stood behind barbed wire, still processing what they had just seen. In the Third Reich, women's roles had been defined long before the war began. Nazi ideology placed them within a narrow framework: Kinder, Kusch, Kirche. Children, kitchen, church. Heroic womanhood was measured through motherhood, sacrifice, and service to the Volksgemeinschaft, not through public authority or independent careers. Even as the war deepened and German manpower collapsed, this ideological constraint never disappeared. It was merely stretched, bent, and quietly contradicted by necessity. By 1943, more than 500,000 German women served in the armed forces in support roles. They became radio operators in Luftwaffe bunkers, clerks in field headquarters, drivers, telephonists, searchlight crews, and nurses posted dangerously close to the front. They were indispensable, yet deliberately denied the status or authority given to men. Even the women with the most responsibility worked under constant reminders that their service was temporary, exceptional, and ultimately subordinate. These women entered the war with a particular image of the enemy. German propaganda had not been subtle in its portrayal of American society. Mass culture, magazines, and newsreels painted the United States as materialistic, morally loose, and driven by wealth rather than values. American women were framed as frivolous, immodest, untrained, or overly masculine, either weak or degenerate, depending on the narrative needed that week. Few German women had ever seen an American in person, let alone one in uniform, and almost none had reason to question the carefully constructed images they had been shown. But by late 1944, the reality around them was collapsing. The Reich was shrinking on every front: east, west, north, and south. Air raids destroyed cities week after week. Supply shortages became visible everywhere. Frontline units were desperate for replacements, and entire formations disintegrated under pressure. The auxiliary women who served near communications hubs, airfields, command posts, or military hospitals felt this deterioration firsthand. Many saw wounded soldiers returning from the Eastern Front describing battles that sounded nothing like the triumphant bulletins on the radio. Many worked nights during bombings, sending fragmented messages across failing lines. By early 1945, rumors of the inevitable defeat were impossible to ignore. As Allied ground forces advanced deeper into German territory, female personnel were captured in increasing numbers. Their surrender situations varied. Some were taken at field hospitals, others at Luftwaffe communication sites. Still others gave themselves up with Wehrmacht units retreating through shattered towns. But almost universally, these women expected the same thing: American men as guards and interrogators. Instead, in many processing centers and temporary holding sites, they encountered something they had never imagined: American women in uniform. To grasp the magnitude of that shock, one must understand the gap between what they had been taught and what now stood in front of them. The German women believed female military service to be a wartime necessity, not a sign of agency or empowerment. They had grown up hearing that equality weakened nations and that women who pursued authority undermined social order. Yet here they were, exhausted, defeated, and disoriented, now being registered and questioned by women who seemed to embody the opposite philosophy. The first moments of these encounters were often quiet. German women, still tense from surrender, watched these American personnel work with a confidence that appeared effortless. They noticed the tone of voice used when giving instructions, the way rank insignia rested on shoulders, the discipline of the posture, the freedom of expression. Some German prisoners would later describe it as unsettling, unexpected, or strangely admirable. Others admitted it created a feeling they could not fully name, a sense that their world had been built too narrowly. In these early hours of captivity, before any formal interrogation began, another realization came to the surface. This was not merely the meeting of two armies, but of two visions of womanhood. And the deeper context behind the American side of this contrast would soon become unmistakable. This leads directly into the second half of the background, the world the American women came from. To understand why American women seemed so unfamiliar, so disorienting, to the German prisoners, we must look closely at the world that shaped them. Unlike their German counterparts, American women entered the war from a society that, while imperfect, had long allowed a broader range of public roles, especially during national crises. By the time U.S. forces landed in Europe, American women had already lived through major shifts in work, education, and civic life that made their military presence not only possible, but widely accepted. The Women's Army Corps, WAC, established in 1942, marked one of the most visible transformations. By 1945, more than 100,000 women had served under its banner. Clerks, mechanics, drivers, cryptographers, meteorologists, and intelligence analysts. They wore proper uniforms, held rank structures, received training, underwent inspections, and earned respect from many commanders who relied on their competence. Their work was not framed as a temporary bending of ideology for wartime needs. It was presented officially and culturally as a legitimate contribution to national defense. Other organizations reflected the same momentum. The Women Air Force Service pilots, WASPs, ferried bombers and fighters, often flying aircraft that male pilots would later take into combat. Navy WAVs, Marine Corps Women's Reserve Units, and Coast Guard SPARs expanded women's visibility inside military hierarchies. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of nurses served near frontline areas or aboard hospital ships, where discipline, decision-making, and technical skill could mean life or death within minutes. To U.S. commanders, the presence of women in uniform had become routine. To German women raised in a stricter framework of gender ideology, the sight of these Americans exercising authority felt like a rupture in the natural order. Another source of shock lay in the material contrast. American uniforms, clean, well-tailored, standardized, reflected a military not yet drained by 6 years of total war. Supplies were abundant. Pay was reliable. Personal items like toiletries, stationery, and ration chocolates were common. German auxiliaries and nurses, by contrast, had become used to shortages. Their uniforms were often patched or faded. Rations had deteriorated. Many had gone weeks without adequate rest. To see American women not only well-equipped, but confidently performing military duties blurred the line between enemy and symbol. These soldiers represented a world the German women had been taught to distrust, and one that now appeared visibly prosperous, organized, and self-assured. But it was not only outward appearance that left an impression. It was the way American women interacted with them. When U.S. female personnel worked in POW processing centers, they carried themselves with a professional calm that surprised German prisoners. They issued instructions with clarity, moved briskly across the grounds, and operated with an ease born from training and structure. Some spoke gently, others were firm. All demonstrated a level of autonomy that German women simply did not associate with military environments. Interrogators, clerks, medical teams, and MPs operated as a coordinated system, not a supporting auxiliary. Reports collected after the war reveal specific moments of realization. German women noted how American personnel made direct eye contact when giving orders, a gesture that in German military culture was often reserved for men. They noticed the casual normality with which American women conversed with male colleagues, something that would have been viewed with suspicion or impropriety in many German units. They observed the respect shown by American men toward their female counterparts, including the simple act of addressing them by rank. And perhaps most striking of all, they witnessed the unmistakable sense of individual confidence, a quiet, unhurried self-assurance, not arrogance, competence. For prisoners who had grown up under years of ideological messaging, the experience created a psychological tension that few expected. Many found themselves comparing what they were seeing with what they had always believed. Others felt unease, admiration, or even envy. A number spoke later about the moment they realized just how differently the two nations had envisioned a woman's place in society. These encounters did not end at the processing yards. As the days and weeks continued within POW camps, American women continued to appear in roles the Germans had never associated with their gender: administrators, nurses in command roles, and military police conducting inspections. And as this repeated exposure deepened, the shock evolved into something more complex and more personal. This sets up the heart of the documentary, the many angles through which these encounters reshaped perceptions. For many German women, the greatest impact of encountering American female personnel was not the uniform or the rank. It was the challenge to everything they had been taught about womanhood. Nazi ideology had long promoted a strict hierarchy of roles, framed not as cultural preference, but as biological destiny. Women were caretakers, supporters, and moral anchors of the home. Their service in wartime was always contextualized as an extension of their domestic duties, never as independent authority. Seeing American women operating comfortably within military structures contradicted years of indoctrination. The prisoners watched these women give instructions, manage paperwork, oversee operations, and coordinate with male officers as equals. There were no signs of societal collapse, no erosion of discipline, no weakening of military order. Claims often repeated in German propaganda when describing nations with higher gender equality. The ideological shock did not arrive as a dramatic epiphany. It was quiet, incremental, and deeply personal. A German telephonist might observe the direct, unhesitating tone of a WC sergeant. A nurse might notice the respect American male officers showed toward their female medical staff. A clerk might feel a jolt of recognition when she saw a woman her own age supervising a processing table with practiced authority. These moments accumulated, Each one chipped away at the belief that strict gender hierarchy was natural or necessary. For some, it was the first time they realized how narrow their world had been. An ideological shock soon gave way to something even more difficult to ignore: the way American women carried their authority. Authority expresses itself not only through rank insignia, but through posture, tone, and bearing. German women noticed this immediately. American female personnel walked differently, shoulders back, strides firm, eyes level. They addressed prisoners with a mix of discipline and professionalism that felt foreign to those who had grown up in strictly stratified social structures. Many German women had spent years navigating military environments where authority belonged overwhelmingly to men. Even the most experienced auxiliaries operated in a framework where initiative was limited, orders flowed downward, and unquestioning obedience was expected. To see women functioning independently within the American military hierarchy felt almost surreal. One of the most striking impressions involved how American women interacted with their male colleagues. German prisoners saw WAC corporals giving instructions to male privates without hesitation. They saw nurses directing male medics during triage. They witnessed American MPs, some of them women, enforcing discipline without question. These interactions were direct, matter-of-fact, and treated as entirely normal. The authority did not come from aggression or superiority. It came from training, confidence, and an institutional culture that, though imperfect, treated women's competence as an asset rather than an exception. To German prisoners, this was perhaps the most unsettling realization. Authority did not make these women unfeminine. It made them effective. And as the Germans compared this with their own restricted roles, another angle emerged, rooted not in ideology or authority, but in the material realities of wartime life. War magnifies differences between nations, and in 1945 the contrast between Germany's deteriorating conditions and America's industrial strength was stark. German female prisoners saw it immediately in the uniforms, equipment, and even personal belongings of American women. The WAC uniforms were crisp, well-fitted, and standardized. Boots were in good condition. Jackets were neatly pressed. Many American women carried small pouches with toiletries, notebooks, pens, ration bars, or medical supplies, items that had become scarce luxuries within the collapsing Reich. The Germans noticed watches, clean gloves, even small mirrors. These were not symbols of vanity. They were reminders of a military still sustained by factories, logistics, and a stable home front. For German auxiliaries whose rations had grown thin and whose uniforms were often patched or threadbare, the contrast was difficult to ignore. Even more striking was the casual normality with which American women carried these items. They did not treat them as treasures. They treated them as standard issue. This disparity extended into food, equipment, and medical care. American women distributing rations or registering prisoners did so with supplies that felt abundant compared to Germany's shortages. POW nurses saw firsthand the efficiency of American medical systems, and some admitted privately that the level of organization surpassed what they had known in their own units. Material differences alone could not explain the deeper shock German women felt, but they amplified it, illuminating how differently the two societies had mobilized their people. And together, these angles formed the foundation for the next set of perspectives, more emotional, more personal, and even more revealing. Beyond ideology, uniforms, or resources, what struck many German female prisoners most was the human simplicity of the American women standing before them. The war had dehumanized entire nations. Propaganda had reduced enemies to caricatures. Yet here, In the quiet routines of processing camps, German women encountered something they had never expected: ordinary human interaction. Some American women offered water to dehydrated prisoners without being asked. Others reassured anxious captives during medical checks. A few, especially nurses, spoke with a tone that was firm but not hostile, professional but not punitive. These small gestures carried weight. They challenged the German assumption that enemy authority meant cruelty. Many German prisoners later recalled their surprise at being treated with procedural fairness rather than contempt. They had been prepared for humiliation, yet they encountered a system that, though rigid and impersonal, functioned without unnecessary hostility. For women who had grown up under a regime that emphasized suspicion and ideological purity, this baseline professionalism felt strangely disarming. Small exchanges left lasting impressions. A WAC sergeant sharing a cigarette, a nurse adjusting a bandage with practice calm, a female MP explaining camp rules in clear, neutral tones. These moments did not erase the hardships of captivity, but they softened the edges of fear and allowed German prisoners to see their captors not as monsters, but as individuals. This human encounter did something deeper. It highlighted an emotional strength that German ideology had never emphasized, and that strength became unmistakable in the next angle: confidence. Confidence can be more powerful than any weapon. To German women raised in strict hierarchies, the natural, unforced confidence of American women felt almost unreal. It was not arrogance, loudness, or bravado. It was a quiet certainty, an internal permission to exist without apology. They saw in the way American women spoke: direct, clear, unapologetically assertive. They saw it in posture: shoulders square, chin steady, movements efficient. They saw it in emotional composure. American women did not seem intimidated by the presence of male officers or flustered when handling tense moments. German prisoners had been taught that self-assuredness in women was unfeminine or disruptive. Yet here, confidence blended seamlessly with competence. It enhanced authority instead of undermining it. Some Germans found it unsettling. Others found it admirable. A few, quietly, found it enviable. Psychologists who later interviewed female POWs noted this recurring theme. The Americans acted as though they belonged there. This single observation captured the core of the shock. Belonging, real, institutional belonging, was something German military women never fully experienced. This recognition soon fed into deeper emotional currents, bringing forward a difficult and often unspoken angle: respect. Respect is rarely admitted openly in wartime, especially toward the enemy. Yet many German female prisoners later recalled an involuntary sense of admiration toward the American women they encountered. It was a respectful discomfort, an internal conflict between indoctrinated belief and observable reality. On one hand, they were prisoners of a foreign army. On the other, they saw qualities: confidence, stability, professional competence, that they had never been encouraged to cultivate in themselves. Some German women felt shame, not from mistreatment, but from comparison. They wondered what they might have accomplished had their society valued their abilities differently. Others felt a growing sense of curiosity about life in the United States, shaped not by propaganda, but by the brief human contact they experienced through their captors. A few admitted to being deeply unsettled by the realization that American women seemed more secure, more autonomous, and more respected within their own military structure. This mixture of discomfort and admiration created a psychological pivot point, a moment when ideology no longer aligned with lived experience. And it set the stage for the turning point of the documentary, the climax where these encounters shifted from observation to meaningful consequence. For the war was ending, the Reich collapsing, and the personal revelations of these prisoners would intertwine with the broader transformation unfolding around them. By late April 1945, the German Reich was collapsing in every direction. Cities were surrendering, units dissolving, and command structures breaking apart. In this chaos, thousands of German female auxiliaries, nurses, and administrative personnel were captured by advancing American forces. What had begun as scattered encounters with U.S. female personnel soon became a widespread experience across multiple POW collection points in Germany. The decisive shift, the true turning point, occurred when these German women were moved from temporary holding yards to organized, fully functioning POW camps. It was here, within structured systems rather than improvised field sites, that the contrast between the two societies became impossible to ignore. For the German prisoners, arrival at these camps marked the end of uncertainty, but the beginning of a deeper internal confrontation. The processing centers were run with strict schedules, standardized procedures, and a professionalism that felt almost industrial. Yet among the guards, administrative staff, and medical teams, the presence of American women remained constant and increasingly influential. At one large camp near Remagen, female MPs supervised registration and oversaw the daily roll calls. Their presence was not symbolic. It was operational. They carried out duties that in the German system would have been reserved for male officers. They issued instructions calmly, corrected errors without hesitation, and enforced rules with measured authority. German prisoners watched them interact with male American MPs as equals, their roles defined by training rather than gender. This environment produced a decisive psychological rupture. If earlier encounters had sparked curiosity and surprise, the structured routines of camp life transformed those impressions into something harder to dismiss: evidence. Evidence that American women were fully integrated into military systems. Evidence that they held responsibility without apology. Evidence that the social order the German women had known was neither universal nor inevitable. The turning point became even clearer during medical processing. Nurses from the U.S. Army Nurse Corps conducted examinations, recorded medical histories, and managed triage areas with a level of authority far greater than their German counterparts were accustomed to. They supervised male medics, coordinated supply distribution, and gave direct orders during emergencies. Their competence was visible, immediate, and undeniable. Some German women experienced frustration or embarrassment during these moments, not because of mistreatment, but because it highlighted what their own roles could have been under different circumstances. A Reich Labor Service nurse later recalled in her post-war testimony that watching American nurses command entire rooms without raising their voice felt like witnessing a different future that had never been offered to her. Another decisive moment occurred during camp interrogations. Although male intelligence officers conducted most interviews, female WAC clerks and translators worked beside them. They handled documents, typed reports, organized files, and cross-referenced information with rapid precision. German women, seated across from these American personnel, observed not only efficiency, but partnership. Men and women operating side by side without discomfort or skepticism. The German auxiliaries noticed that authority was distributed based on skill, not ideology. A WSC corporal could speak decisively. A male lieutenant could ask her to verify records without hesitation. It was a dynamic the German prisoners had rarely, if ever, seen in their own military structures. The point of no return. The moment in which initial impressions transformed into a lasting internal shift often came during daily camp routines. American women performed inspections. They delivered messages. They issued supplies. They interacted with prisoners in professional, predictable ways. Their presence was not momentary. It was sustained, and sustained exposure made the comparison unavoidable. German women began to articulate their thoughts privately, sometimes in small, whispered conversations within the barracks. Some expressed surprise that American women could display authority without sacrificing femininity. Others admitted that the Americans seemed more composed under pressure, more accustomed to responsibility. A few remarked on the confidence with which American women interacted with male officers, confidence that forced the Germans to reevaluate their own conditioning. One particularly striking detail appeared repeatedly in post-war interviews. German women were astonished by the way American women looked them directly in the eyes when speaking. Direct gaze, calm expression, no hesitation, no deference. In the German military, many women have been trained to avert their eyes when addressing male authority, or even senior female supervisors conditioned by traditional hierarchy. But here, the American women spoke to them with steady, level-eyed professionalism that felt unfamiliar and unsettling. This growing recognition, rooted in repeated exposure, concrete evidence, and lived experience, became the turning point. It was not one dramatic event, but a cumulative realization. The world they had been raised to believe in was not the only world possible, and it was not the stronger one. The American women's confidence, authority, and self-assured presence now stood in stark contrast to the collapsing Reich outside the camp fences. As news filtered in, Berlin encircled, Hitler isolated, entire armies surrendering. The German women faced a moment of internal reckoning. The authority they saw in American women was not a temporary wartime illusion. It was the expression of a society that had mobilized differently, more flexibly, more inclusively, and ultimately more effectively. And as this realization crystallized, the narrative moved toward its most intense phase, where individual perceptions intersected with the final events of the war and the collapse of the ideology that had shaped these prisoners' lives. The more the American women worked their way down the processing line, the more the atmosphere changed. At first, the German auxiliaries avoided eye contact, trying to hold on to the last thin layers of discipline and distance. But discipline could not hide exhaustion. It could not hide the trembling hands, the hollow cheeks, the realization that the Reich they had served was collapsing hour by hour. Some of the older auxiliaries, women who had spent years inside radio stations, intelligence posts, and air defense networks, answered questions with clipped formality. But even they could not hide the shock that grew with every passing interaction. Their interrogators were not the harsh male caricatures they had been warned about. They were not the unfeminine, chaotic Americans that propaganda posters had mocked. Instead, they were composed, self-assured, and unshaken by the tension around them. One German signal operator, still wearing a worn-out Luftwaffe patch, froze when an American gently asked if she needed water before beginning basic processing. The German woman nodded, then caught herself, pulling her lips into a thin line. She had just accepted kindness from an enemy she had been taught to hate. But the WWII simply handed her the canteen and moved on, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Moments like this spread along the line. Quiet, human moments that undercut years of ideology. At one table, a young German interpreter, barely 20, watched an American MP adjust her helmet strap, then return a confiscated scarf to a prisoner because it was cold and not a security risk. The prisoner whispered a thank you. The MP shrugged it off. Yet the German interpreter kept staring. She had grown up on rigid gender expectations, on strict roles, on the idea that authority and femininity existed in separate universes. Now she was watching women who carried both effortlessly. Across the yard, another unexpected scene formed. An American nurse tending to a German typist whose hands shook too much to sign her intake card. The nurse steadied her wrist, spoke quietly, and waited for the woman's breathing to calm. A nearby group of German helpers exchanged glances. None of this matched the narrative they had been taught. And it wasn't only the auxiliaries who noticed. The male German POWs, waiting in a separate cordoned section, watched as well. Some stared with disbelief, others with resentment, a few with a strange mixture of respect and confusion. They, too, had grown up under a regime that insisted a woman's place was strictly defined. Yet here, in the fading light of a collapsing Reich, they were witnessing something they had never seen before. Women commanding a space with competence, authority, and understated strength. What struck them even harder was the discipline of the Americans. No shouting, no gloating, no unnecessary displays of power. The WACs and MPs worked with a steady rhythm, recording information, offering instructions, maintaining firm boundaries. They carried themselves the way frontline medics or logistics officers might, focused, purposeful, unwavering. It was professionalism that required no theatrics. This quiet authority became the turning point of the entire interaction. Not the documents, not the interrogations, not the badges or the pistols, but the contrast. Because in the German camp system, women in uniform had been auxiliaries, support staff. Here, the American women were not auxiliary to anyone. They were the process. They were the authority. And they showed that authority without cruelty. As the hours passed, the psychological shift deepened. Some of the German women began to ask cautious questions, not about the war, but about the Americans themselves. What were their duties? How long had they served? Did they volunteer? The WACs answered with brief, professional replies, never drifting into conversation, but never dismissing curiosity either. Each answer chipped away at something older, something brittle. By the time the sun dipped behind the ruined rooftops, the yard felt subtly, but unmistakably, different. The tension had not vanished, but the fear had, replaced by something quieter, something closer to respect. And it was in this changed atmosphere, with the identification line nearly complete, that the next stage began, one that would reveal even more, not through conflict, but through comparison. Even after the final names were recorded and the last intake cards stacked neatly on the table, the German auxiliaries did not immediately disperse. They remained in small clusters across the yard, quietly processing what they had just witnessed. The cold evening air settled around them, carrying the distant thud of artillery far to the east, reminders that the war was still grinding forward, even as their own roles had abruptly ended. American guards directed them toward a temporary holding barrack for the night. The women walked in groups, boots crunching against gravel, blankets issued, possessions logged. Yet the mood was no longer the brittle, defensive fear of their arrival. Something else lingered, a dissonant blend of confusion, relief, and reluctant admiration. Inside the dim barrack, a few German auxiliaries spoke softly among themselves. One of the radio operators kept repeating the same line in disbelief. Sie waren so ruhig, so sicher. They were so calm, so sure of themselves. She had never seen military women behave that way. Not in training, not in service, not in the propaganda reel shown in barracks halls. Another woman, an office clerk from a Luftwaffe signals detachment, sat on her bunk staring at her hands. If we had behaved like that, she whispered, we would have been called unmilitarish, unmilitary, improper. The others nodded. The Reich had always insisted that women could serve but never lead, could work but never command, could assist but never define the tone of a room. Yet today, American women had done exactly that. Some auxiliaries felt uneasy, even defensive. Their worldview had been shaken in ways they didn't yet know how to articulate. But others, especially the younger ones, felt something closer to hope. Not hope for the war, which was clearly lost, but hope for what might come after. If women could have authority like that, could move through a military zone with that kind of confidence, what else might be possible? Across the yard, the American personnel held their own debrief. The WACs and MP women compared notes, reviewed procedures, and ensured the prisoners were secured safely for the night. For them, The day had been routine, one of many processing operations during the final months of the war. But even they had noticed the reactions. One WWII mentioned how the German auxiliaries kept staring at her holstered sidearm, as if it were some kind of contradiction. Another observed how the older German women avoided any direct glance, as though unsure how to engage with a woman in authority at all. Yet no one mocked them. No one gloated. These were trained personnel who understood the psychological weight of the moment. By 2,100 hours, the yard had grown quiet. The sky over the captured town was dark except for the dull glow of fires still smoldering in distant ruins. Inside the barrack, the German auxiliaries lay on thin mattresses, listening to the muffled sounds of American patrols outside. Sleep did not come easily. Their minds replayed the images of the day. The calm American interrogators, the steady voices, the unexpected offers of water and warmth. Gradually, a realization settled in among them. Unspoken but shared, they had encountered not humiliation, but competence. Not brutality, but order. Not arrogance, but professionalism. This, more than anything, unsettled their old beliefs. The next morning, as dawn filtered weakly through the barrack windows, a few auxiliaries lingered before stepping out into the yard. They wanted one last look at the American women who had broken so many of their assumptions with nothing more than discipline and quiet authority. And they would remember that contrast long after the war ended. In repatriation camps, in denazification hearings, in the private reflections of a defeated nation trying to understand how everything had changed. Because for many of them, the moment of greatest ideological fracture had not come from a battlefield defeat or a political collapse, but from standing in front of women who were everything they had been taught a woman never could be. The processing of the German auxiliaries continued over the following days, but the atmosphere had permanently shifted. What began as a routine prisoner intake gradually evolved into something deeper, an unspoken study in contrasts observed quietly by both sides. By late April 1945, thousands of female German personnel across collapsing fronts were falling into Allied custody. Many had served in communications units, administrative offices, air raid control centers, and field hospitals. Their surrender was not marked by dramatic battles, but by the steady erosion of the Reich's defenses and the rapid advance of Allied forces. In camp after camp, similar moments unfolded, German women encountering American women who held rank, authority, and responsibility. The reactions varied, but the underlying shock was consistent. For many auxiliaries, this was their first direct exposure to a system where female service members were expected to show initiative rather than obedience, confidence rather than modesty, leadership rather than silence. Within the U.S. forces, the Women's Army Corps had been operating for 3 years by this point, embedded in logistics, intelligence, cryptography, communications, and military police roles. Their training emphasized discipline, professionalism, and parity within the limits of wartime policy. To the WACs, confidence was not a performance, it was a requirement. The German women recognized this immediately. Across holding facilities, conversations spread in whispered fragments. Some auxiliaries described the American women as unverschämt selbstbewusst, shamelessly, self-assured, but the words were spoken with more awe than disdain. Others admitted privately that they had never imagined a woman giving orders to men, much less being obeyed without hesitation. A cultural wall had cracked, and once cracked, it could never quite be resealed. Meanwhile, Allied interrogators, male and female, took careful notes on the backgrounds of these women. Many had joined the auxiliary services not out of ideology, but out of economic necessity or wartime mobilization. Their stories revealed a generation raised under a system that restricted women to narrowly defined roles, even as the demands of total war forced them into wider responsibilities. Yet the contradiction had always remained: serve but never command. Work but never lead. Assist but never stand equal. Now, in captivity, that contradiction was illuminated starkly by the presence of American women who did those things daily. Camp reports from U.S. personnel recorded the auxiliary prisoners as generally cooperative, often weary, and occasionally introspective. Some wrote letters home describing their astonishment at the American military women. Others mentioned it in interviews, noting how differently the U.S. approached female service roles. When the war ended in May 1945, the processing centers transitioned from military necessities to administrative gateways. Many of the auxiliaries were released within weeks after background reviews confirmed they had not been involved in criminal activities. But even after repatriation, the memory of those encounters remained vivid. In post-war Germany, where society struggled to rebuild from ruins and redefine itself, many former auxiliaries quietly reflected on the roles they had seen American women occupy. For some, it became an early marker of the societal shifts that would unfold in the decades ahead, shifts that would reshape gender expectations across Europe. Historians studying interviews from the late 1940s and 1950s have noted recurring themes in testimonies from these women. Surprise at American female professionalism, admiration for their discipline, and confusion at how naturally they moved in positions German women had been denied. One former Luftwaffe clerk would later summarize it simply in a denazification interview. Es war das erste Mal, das ich gesehen habe, wie es auch hat sein können. It was the first time I saw how it could have been. For the American women, the experience left a quieter impression. They viewed the German auxiliaries not as ideological opponents, but as individuals, many young, tired, and uncertain of their own futures. Their task had been bureaucratic, not symbolic. Yet the symbolism had emerged anyway. The war had been won, but the ideas that survived, the lessons, the contrasts, the revelations, would continue evolving long after the gunfire ceased. And from this aftermath, a larger reflection begins to form. In the long quiet after 1945, when uniforms were folded away and nations began the slow work of rebuilding, the memory of those brief encounters between German auxiliaries and American servicewomen lingered like an imprint on a page. Not dramatic, not violent, but revealing. War often defines itself through battles, strategies, and devastation. Yet sometimes its most enduring lessons come from moments far removed from gunfire. Moments when two worlds meet and neither is quite prepared for what the other represents. For the German auxiliaries, the sight of American women in positions of authority forced a re-evaluation that no propaganda could prevent. They had been raised within rigid boundaries, taught that strength and command belonged exclusively to men. Then, in the collapse of the Reich, they encountered women who moved confidently across those boundaries as though they had never been there at all. It was not triumph that shifted their understanding, nor humiliation. It was normalcy, the effortless certainty with which American women carried out their duties. In those simple motions, the auxiliaries glimpsed a different version of womanhood, capable, assertive, unrestricted. It contradicted everything they had been told, yet it was undeniable. For the American servicewomen, the moment was less ideological, but no less human. They saw opponents who were not hardened ideologues, but young women shaped by years of controlled messaging and limited opportunity. Their professionalism offered a quiet counterpoint to the chaos around them, proving that dignity can exist even at the end of a brutal war. History rarely remembers these exchanges. They leave no monuments, no headline victories, but they mark the subtle shifts that influence generations. In the uncertainty of captivity and surrender, those German auxiliaries found themselves confronting not just defeat, but a new possibility, one that would echo later as women in post-war Europe pushed for broader rights, broader roles, broader horizons. In that sense, the real change did not arrive with the tanks or the treaties. It arrived in a moment of astonishment, when confidence, worn calmly on the shoulders of American women, challenged an entire worldview. And sometimes that is how history turns.